the parents who made the worst mistake, and their children thus came into the world in Mexico City. No one knew what happened behind that door. In one of Iztapalapa's many nameless streets, the house seemed empty, always in semi-darkness, with closed accordion blinds and a rusty gate that never opened. Neighbors said an elderly woman lived there with her son, but no one had seen them go out together for years. Some assured that they had heard children's voices behind the walls, but the laughter was so faint that it sounded like echoes of a lost time. What no one suspected was that in this home, 2 children were trapped in a world of silence, pain, and shadows, as a result of a mistake that should never have been made. I am Burgo, and this is Mexico Prohibido. If you want to learn the most hidden stories that you will never see in the news, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. What you are about to hear is not a fable, nor a story made to frighten you. It is a narrative that represents what can happen when neglect, ignorance, and shame tragically intertwine in the heart of a family. A story that hurts, but must be told. Maria was barely 20 years old when she gave birth to Tomas, her only son. She had been abandoned by the child's father even before her belly became visible. When her own parents found out, they threw her out of the house. They called it sin, shame, punishment. Maria had nowhere to go and ended up in a rented room behind a hardware store, eating stale bread and washing clothes to survive. Under these conditions, she raised her son. Tomas grew up seeing his mother's tired face as his only mirror. He had no grandparents, aunts, or cousins. He knew no parks, no birthdays, no regular school. His world was her, only her. Maria did what she could. She avoided glances, comments, questions. She kept Tomas away from everything. She taught him to read with newspapers found in the trash. She prepared him hard tortillas with canned beans. She told him the world was dangerous, that no one out there wanted them. They spoke to no one. They changed houses at least 6 times in 15 years. And with each move, they moved a little further away from society and any possibility of help. In the eyes of everyone, they were just a discreet mother and son. But within those walls, the story took a different turn. Over time, what began as emotional dependence transformed into a deeper confusion. Tomas had no role models. He did not understand boundaries. Maria, tired, lonely, and internally broken. She, too, stopped seeing the lines that separate love from error. When he was 20 and she was 45, they already shared the same mattress. No one knew it. No one knocked on their door. No one dared to ask. Thus, Luis was born, the first child. A silent birth at home, without a midwife or hospital. Maria bled for hours. Tomas held her hand as she trembled. The child did not cry at birth. He only let out a faint groan as if he lacked the strength to scream. His head was disproportionate, his neck weak, and he did not open his eyes properly. Maria knew at that moment that something was wrong, but she asked no questions. She just wrapped him in an old blanket and sang him a song her mother had taught her as a child. That was her way of asking for forgiveness. 3 years later, Emmanuel would be born. This time the crying came, but accompanied by a stiffness of the limbs that prevented him from moving like a healthy baby. He also had difficulty eating. He vomited frequently, and his eyes did not follow objects. Maria and Tomas sought no help. They dared not. There was fear, yes, but above all, there was shame. How to explain the inexplicable? how to look a doctor in the eye and say, "He is my son, and also his father." The family closed in even more. They covered the windows with blankets. They stopped going out even for shopping. Sometimes whole days passed without turning on the light. Tomas cooked on a grate with salt. Maria washed rags with rainwater. The children cried a lot. Luis had pain crises that lasted hours. Emmanuel convulsed at night, and his parents held him until his body calmed down. Neither of them spoke. Not a word. Only guttural sounds, meaningless screams. They did not know what a toy was, nor a school, nor an outside caress. Then Lucia Ramirez, a social worker from the health sector, arrived in the neighborhood. Her task was simple: to visit homes with unregistered children and check their condition. When she arrived at Maria's door, she had no idea what she would find. She knocked 3 times. No one answered. She persisted. Finally, Maria opened the door. She was thin, with disheveled hair, her gaze lowered. Tomas appeared behind her, nervous, and in the background, the children. Lucia said nothing at first. She observed. She felt. Her experience told her that something else was there, but she didn't know exactly what. She noticed the tense bodies of the little ones. The forced postures, the absolute silence. She asked for their names. Maria said them. She asked for their age. They hesitated. She asked if they were registered. Maria shook her head. Lucia asked who Tomas was. Maria mumbled, "He is the father of my children." Days later, in a more intimate conversation, Maria broke down. She told everything. From the beginning, there was no justification, only weeping. She said she didn't know how to stop, that she loved him, that she hated him, that she was afraid, that she had tried to disappear, but couldn't leave her children. Tomas remained silent. He accepted every word without resistance. He seemed to understand, but not completely. It was as if he couldn't process the world beyond those 4 walls. Lucia decided to act. She did not report it immediately. She sought medical support. She contacted an NGO. She knew that this case could not be handled with scandal, but with extreme care. The children were taken to a specialized center. There, what was suspected was confirmed. The malformations were consistent with direct consanguineous relationships, but no one condemned them. The doctors, the nurses, the volunteers all looked at Lucia and Manuel with compassion. Luis urgently needed physiotherapy. His spine was twisted, his legs atrophied. Emmanuel needed constant medication to control seizures. Both showed severe intellectual disability, but they also showed something else, a strange ability to respond to affection. When a nurse caressed them, they smiled. When they heard soft music, they calmed down, as if a spark of life still resided within them, waiting to be recognized. Maria and Tomas were separated. She began psychological treatment. He was placed in a psychiatric clinic. There was no judgment. There was no imprisonment. Just a long and painful process of human reintegration. Maria was allowed to see her children once a week. Tomas never saw them again, and perhaps that was for the best for everyone. A single photo was taken before the house was closed. Luis sat on the floor. Emmanuel leaned on his legs, both with half-closed eyes, pale skin, hands intertwined, as if one were the other's refuge. This image will not be published, out of respect. But it is enough to imagine it to understand the magnitude of the pain that silence can cause. And also the hope that arises when, even in darkness, someone lights a small light. When Maria began to tell her story to the Foundation's support team, her words were not linear or clear. They were fragments, silences interspersed with memories that seemed like ghosts. Sometimes she cried silently. Sometimes she stared at a fixed point on the wall, as if she still didn't understand how she had gotten there. She did not present herself as a victim or a culprit. She presented herself as a broken woman, like so many others whom life had pushed into a corner where there was no longer room to distinguish love from harm. She said Tomas had been a quiet child who never raised his voice, who demanded nothing, that he was always close, like a loving shadow, like a companion of silence. After the age of 15, he began to take care of her. If she was sick, he cooked for her. If she cried, he wiped her forehead with a damp cloth. Maria looked at him and felt she couldn't live without him, but she never thought that bond would end so painfully. There was no exact moment, no specific date, just the passing of time and the lack of everything else. Lucia, the social worker who led the care, wrote in her notebook, "This case is not about monstrosity. It is about neglect, about the repetition of cycles, about deep emotional deficiencies. No one cared for them. No one stopped them. And when they wanted to ask for help, it was already too late." Tomas, for his part, spoke little. In clinical interviews, he answered with short sentences, emotionless. Sometimes he smiled without reason. He didn't seem to fully understand why he was there. When asked if he loved Maria, he said yes. When asked if he knew she was his mother, he also answered yes. But there seemed to be no conflict between the two answers. For him, that was his world. It was the only thing he knew. It was the only thing he understood. The specialists who treated Luis and Emmanuel explained in simple words that both showed structural changes in the central nervous system, which made physical and cognitive development difficult. Luis could barely stand on his feet, even with help. His back was deformed, his jaw recessed, and his vision severely impaired. Emmanuel had frequent epileptic seizures and a weakened immune system. Both required constant specialized care. But the saddest thing was not their physical condition, but that neither of them knew what a hug from someone outside their family was. They knew no gentle voice. They had never had contact with other children. They lived in a language of their own, consisting of groans, gestures, and gazes full of need. A nurse named Patricia, who worked at the rehabilitation center where they were housed, recounted that one afternoon as she sang a children's song. Luis slowly crawled and rested his head on her lap. He remained like that for minutes, without moving. Emmanuel, seeing this, cried for the first time since their arrival, not from pain, but from something deeper, something he couldn't name. Patricia said that at that moment she understood that these children didn't need pity. It was love, nothing more. Meanwhile, Maria went through a slow process of emotional recovery. She attended therapy sessions twice a week. She spoke with a psychologist who never interrupted her. Little by little, she began to draw. At first they were formless scribbles. Later, figures appeared. A house with a single window, a seated woman, 2 children holding hands. In one of the drawings, she placed a broken heart above the 4. In another, she painted a dark cloud over her head and a cross over Tomas's chest. When asked what it meant, she said, "It's guilt." Nothing more. As the story spread in closed professional circles, divided opinions arose. Some believed Maria and Tomas should be punished. that it was not possible to allow such a relationship without legal consequences. Others, however, defended that the most important thing was the children's well-being and that no punishment would fix what was broken. Lucia remained firm in her position: protect, accompany, and avoid sensationalism, not to let the case become news or a scandal. What was needed was respectful silence and effective action. The atmosphere in the care home changed. Luis began to move his arms more forcefully. Emmanuel no longer had seizures every day. The medical team celebrated every small advance like a victory. Once, during a group activity, Emmanuel managed to place 3 colored building blocks in the correct order. No one had expected it. The therapists applauded. Luis looked at his brother and laughed. It was a short, awkward, but genuine laugh. Patricia cried when she saw it. During a scheduled visit, Maria was able to hug her children. It was a silent scene. She knelt before them without saying a word and placed her forehead against Luis's. Emmanuel slowly approached and hugged her with his thin arms. No one said anything. Those present lowered their gaze. It was a sacred moment. There was no room for judgment, only for pain, redemption, and tenderness. Tomas, on the other hand, remained at the clinic for psychiatric evaluation. The doctors said he showed immature affective development. His perception of the world was limited. He showed neither aggressiveness nor rebellion, only a constant sadness, an empty expression. In the first few weeks, he did not speak. Then he began to repeat phrases like, "I took care of them. I didn't want to harm them. They're well, right?" No one had easy answers. A staff member at the center named Maria wrote in her diary, "Tomas is not a criminal. He is the product of a system that forgot him. No one taught him to love properly." And now everything he knew has been destroyed. The story, though unknown to the public, began to leave deep traces on the professionals who accompanied it. There were nights when Lucia couldn't sleep. She thought of Maria, alone, washing clothes in the yard, of Tomas carrying buckets of water, of the children crying without knowing why. She thought of all that could have been avoided, of all that was not done in time. In a group session, a therapist asked the volunteers what they had learned from this case. Patricia answered first. She said that love without guidance can become tragedy, that shame can be more lethal than violence, and that children, even in the greatest darkness, can respond to light if it comes without judgment. That night, Lucia wrote in her notebook, "God did not forget this family, we did, and now we must repair what we let fall." Outside, in the streets of Iztapalapa, life went on as usual. No one knew what had happened in that house with the damp walls. No one spoke of the woman who had raised her son in silence. No one asked about the children with twisted bodies and glassy eyes. But in a small treatment room, 2 lives began to blossom, albeit late, albeit amidst ruins, albeit the mistake could never be undone. In the days following that meeting between Maria and her children, something began to transform within her. She no longer spoke with her head bowed, nor answered in monosyllables. Her gaze was still sad. Yes, but more frequently there appeared the slight sparkle of someone who had finally found a reason to continue. The therapists noticed that she dressed more carefully, that she brought new drawings, that she asked more detailed questions about Luis and Manuel's treatments. She didn't loudly ask for forgiveness, but she did so with every gesture, as if her way of making amends was to be present. even if the past crushed her. Luis, for his part, began to take steps with the help of a special walker. Every movement was difficult, slow, but firm. The team celebrated each of these steps as an act of resistance. Emmanuel remained sensitive to sounds, but he no longer flinched at every unknown voice. He had begun to utter single syllables. No one understood what he was saying, but he repeated these syllables, staring at the caregivers, as if asking to be truly heard for the first time. Meanwhile, Tomas continued his evaluation in a psychiatric clinic. The reports indicated that he showed no psychotic disorders or violent tendencies. What he had was more difficult to diagnose: a structural emotional immaturity accompanied by a limited understanding of the impact of his actions. In the eyes of many, he was an adult man, but deep down, he was still the child who had grown up without school, without bonds, without a clear notion of good and evil. The psychologist who cared for him, a patient and methodical woman, wrote that Tomas had not acted with the intention of causing harm, but from a disordered emotional need, and that, although it doesn't excuse him, forces one to look at his case through a different lens, that of compassion. One morning, Luis had a high fever at the care home. His body trembled, and his hands were cold. Emmanuel became agitated seeing him like that. He cried incessantly for more than an hour. He didn't want to let go of him. He clung to his T-shirt with the little strength he had, as if intuitively sensing that his brother was in danger. The doctors acted quickly and were able to stabilize Luis, but this episode left a strong emotional mark on the team. For the first time, the two children showed deep signs of mutual affection. They were not just two small children with disabilities. They were brothers who, in their limited world, cared for each other as best they could. Maria was informed about the episode. She didn't cry, but she spent the entire afternoon in the facility's garden, sitting with her eyes closed, murmuring prayers that were barely audible. At the end of the day, she left a short letter at the reception. It said, "Thank you for not giving up on them. I often gave up on myself. You didn't. That's why they live." The team knew that the recovery process would be long, that there would be no miracles, that Luis and Emmanuel might never walk without help, never speak fluently, never fully understand what had happened around them. But that didn't take away their right to a dignified life, to a warm plate, to a hand that caresses without fear. The caregivers said the hardest part was not treating the illnesses, but breaking down the wall of silence the family had built over decades. But they also knew that every caress, every tenderly repeated word, was a new crack in that wall. And through it, light seeped in. Tomas began to ask questions in his sessions. He wanted to know if his children were eating well, if they slept peacefully, if Maria visited them often. The therapist answered calmly. He nodded his head without speaking. Sometimes he remained motionless, staring at a point on the wall. Sometimes he drew strange figures: a woman with long braids, a child with closed eyes, a house divided in two. He couldn't explain what they meant. He just said they were things he dreamed. One night, he had a crisis. He woke up screaming, repeating the same sentence. "I didn't want to harm them. I didn't want to harm them." The staff on duty held him, calmed him, hugged him. Tomas fell asleep with his head on a caregiver's chest. It was the first time he had accepted physical comfort from another man. In parallel, Maria received an unexpected proposal. A foundation working with women facing forced motherhood and structural abuse offered her a place in a training program. It was an opportunity to learn a trade, to slowly reintegrate into society. At first she hesitated. She was afraid to go out, to be recognized, to hear whispers. But a volunteer told her, "You are not here to hide. You are here to care for those who depend on you." These words struck her heart. She accepted. She began to attend sewing classes 3 times a week. At first she sat in the corner, sewing silently, not looking at anyone. Then gradually, she began to speak. She discovered that many women there had also been expelled from their homes for becoming pregnant young, that others had raised children with disabilities without knowing why. Maria didn't tell her story. She just listened. But in that listening, she found something she hadn't had for years: belonging. One day, in one of these classes, Maria cut herself with the needle and bled. One of her classmates came to help her. She took her hand and said, "We all bleed one way or another. The important thing is not to let the wound get infected." Maria didn't answer. But that night, she wrote in her notebook, "Today, someone touched me without fear." At the care home, Luis spoke his first clear word. He said "mama," with effort, with an awkward tongue, but with intention. It was a moment of complete silence. The caregivers looked at each other, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. Emmanuel looked at him and repeated the same sound, weaker, like an echo. The news reached Maria through a call. She remained silent for several seconds until she said, "I don't deserve it, but thank you." In another room, Tomas listened to his therapist read him a children's story. It was a story about a bird that lived in a cage and didn't know it had wings. Tomas listened attentively, as if the story was about himself. At the end, he asked if birds could also make mistakes. The therapist replied, "Yes, but they could still fly." He thought for a long time. Then he said, "My wings are broken, but my children can still fly." That month, for the first time since everything began, Maria asked permission to visit Tomas. The request was carefully reviewed. Finally, a brief meeting in a controlled environment was approved. They looked at each other without touching. Maria cried, seeing him so thin, so silent. Tomas told her that he was learning to be alone, that he dreamed of seeing Luis walking in a park, that sometimes he imagined Emmanuel laughing with other children. Maria told him that she didn't know how to make amends for what they had done. He replied that perhaps they couldn't, but they could make something better out of what was left. Outside, the day was cloudy, but in that small room, 2 people who had once mistaken love for emptiness began to understand the value of renunciation, of repentance, and of love properly guided. The story did not have a happy ending, but it was far from over. Over the weeks, the case of Maria, Tomas, Luis, and Emmanuel ceased to be a closed file on an official's desk and became a human, intimate, and profound commitment for all those involved in accompanying them. It was no longer just a sad story, nor a hidden anomaly in statistics. It was an open wound in the midst of a city accustomed to looking away. And it was also an opportunity to heal the seemingly incurable, to redeem what was tarnished by ignorance and silence. Luis continued to take small steps, literally, every day with the aluminum walker the foundation had adapted for him. He tried to move a few more centimeters. His legs were thin and stiff, but his eyes lit up when he managed to get from one wall to another. Emmanuel, for his part, had begun to show clearer signs of recognition. When one of the therapists entered the room, he turned his head and stretched out his arms to be picked up. He didn't speak, but he understood. And that fact alone was already a miracle for everyone present. Maria, increasingly involved in her process, asked to volunteer in the community center's kitchen. There she peeled potatoes, served bread, washed dishes. Sometimes she did it in silence, but sometimes a laugh escaped her as she listened to the other women's conversations. She didn't actively participate, but she no longer hid. Some colleagues began to call her the lady with the blue apron and greeted her warmly. She had achieved something unimaginable months before. She was no longer just the woman who had made a mistake, but became Maria, who listens, who helps, who stays. One day, during an integration event at the center, Maria was asked to read a prayer aloud. She hesitated, afraid her voice would tremble, but in the end, she agreed. The prayer spoke of rebuilding what had fallen, of restoring dignity to the little ones, of embracing without asking. When she finished, those present applauded. Maria lowered her head. She was not used to being heard without judgment. On the other side of the city, Tomas continued his therapy process. He was no longer hospitalized. He lived in a transitional home where he could participate in vocational workshops and occasionally receive visitors. His routine was strict: wake up early, exercise, attend group sessions, read. He liked simple stories with pictures, with clear messages. He said stories with open endings scared him. He preferred to know how things ended. During a guided writing session, Tomas wrote a letter he never sent. In it, he spoke to Luis. He told him that although he didn't know how to be a father, he had tried to be a good friend. That every time he saw him sleep, he thought of building him a house without noise, without fear, with a soft bed. That he dreamed of taking him to tall trees, ones that wouldn't fit through the windows. The letter ended like this: "Forgive me for bringing you into the world without teaching you to fly. My wings are broken too." The therapist who accompanied him read the letter in silence and then asked him for permission to keep it. Tomas agreed. He said he didn't want to read it again, but he would like someone to show it to Luis one day, when he was older. Meanwhile, Luis began to show interest in sounds. A volunteer brought a wooden xylophone to the sessions, and he would hit the keys with a short stick, producing high notes. At first he did it without rhythm, but over time he began to repeat sequences. One afternoon as he hit the notes, Emmanuel began to move his head from side to side, as if trying to follow a melody. The caregivers looked at each other, moved. It was the first time that both children actively interacted through a shared stimulus. That same afternoon, Patricia, the nurse who spent the most time with them, asked permission to take a photo. Maria had agreed that her children's progress should be discreetly documented. The picture showed Luis playing the xylophone and Emmanuel looking at him with his mouth half open, in an expression of pure concentration. This image was never published. It was kept in the Foundation's archives, along with other evidence that life, even after the worst mistake, still finds a way to bloom. Maria began to visit the children twice a week. Initially, the visits were short, supervised, limited, but over time, they became more natural. Luis recognized her. Emmanuel relaxed in her arms. She didn't say much. Sometimes she just caressed them in silence. Sometimes she read them short stories. She spoke in a slow voice without hurry, as if time was no longer a threat, but a gift. The caregivers observed from a distance without intervening. They understood that this moment belonged only to them. One afternoon, after a particularly emotional visit, Maria remained sitting in the center's courtyard. A volunteer offered her coffee. She accepted it. They remained silent for a few minutes, watching the rain. Then Maria spoke for the first time about the future. She said she wanted to work. She dreamed of having a clean room for her children. She didn't know if it was possible, but she wanted to try. The volunteer didn't reply with words. She just took her hand. At the internal team meetings, an inevitable question arose. What should happen to Tomas? Some suggested keeping a distance. Others spoke of possible supervised reintegration. The majority agreed that beyond legal or therapeutic decisions, the children's well-being had to be prioritized. Maria, when consulted, was clear. She said she didn't want to revive relationships that had caused harm, that she had learned to love Tomas as a mother, not as a partner, and that she now understood the difference. The director of the foundation proposed something unusual, a symbolic meeting between Tomas and the children without direct contact, but with physical presence. The idea was not to revive a relationship, but to allow Tomas to see what his story had created, for better or worse, and for the children, in their limited understanding, to see a face that no longer represented a threat. The meeting was organized with extreme care. Maria was not present. Luis and Manuel were brought into a room with toys, accompanied by 2 therapists. Tomas entered through a side door, accompanied by his psychologist. He sat several meters away. He said nothing. He just looked at them. Luis, busy with a puzzle, didn't notice him. Emmanuel, however, turned his head and stared fixedly at him for several seconds. Then he turned back to his toy. Tomas cried silently. He did not ask to come closer. He did not raise his voice. He simply remained there, observing the children for whom he felt a love he never knew how to show. When the session ended, he stood up, thanked softly, and left. That night, he wrote another letter, this time addressed to Maria. He told her that he understood her decision, that he didn't blame her for leaving, that he accepted living far away if it meant the children could be happy, and that every time he saw a tall tree, he would think of Luis. Every time he heard a song, he would think of Emmanuel. And that he hoped one day not to be remembered as the one who caused pain, but as the one who knew when to withdraw in time. Maria gave him the letter days later. She did not reply. She only asked that, if he wished, Tomas could receive regular updates on the children's condition. No one forbade it, but it was not encouraged either. The story had somehow found its way. It was no longer an open wound. It was a scar that was beginning to close, and amidst that scar, 2 children continued to grow, slowly, fragilely, but alive. The seasons changed silently, as if time, in that hidden corner of Mexico City, had also learned to tread carefully. The oppressive summer heat slowly gave way to the gentle October rains, and then the cold arrived abruptly, covering the corrugated iron roofs with a delicate and silent hoarfrost. In the care home, the days passed between therapies, children's songs, nutritious snacks, and a carefully planned routine, so that Luis and Manuel finally had something like a childhood. Albeit late, albeit limited, albeit forever marked by the mistakes of others. Luis began to say more words, loose and still awkward, but understandable. He said bread when he was hungry, Mama when he saw Maria coming, water when he was tired. Emmanuel did not yet speak clearly, but it was obvious that he understood. When someone said Maria is coming, he remained motionless, with wide-open eyes, as if holding his breath. And when he saw her enter, he stretched out his arms, smiled with all the available muscles of his face, and let out a high-pitched cry that had no form but meaning. Once, during a medical examination, the specialists found that Emmanuel might need surgery to correct an intestinal obstruction. It was not a high-risk procedure, but it required anesthesia, hospitalization, and post-operative care. Maria signed the papers with a trembling hand, repeatedly asking if there were guarantees, if it wasn't dangerous, if her son would suffer. The operation was performed in a public hospital with the support of the foundation. It was a success, although the recovery days were hard. Emmanuel didn't want to eat, cried constantly, and only calmed down when he heard Luash's voice from a few meters away. Maria asked to sleep in a chair next to the bed. No one refused her. During this hospitalization, a hospital staff member named Sylvia was particularly touched by the story. Every night, at the end of her shift, she would pass by Emmanuel's room to check if everything was okay. She didn't speak much. Sometimes she put an extra blanket or placed a bottle of warm water by the bed. Sometimes she stood at the door, watching Maria sleep sitting up, her arms crossed in her lap, her face overcome by sleep. One morning, Sylvia dared to speak. She said she also had a disabled child, that at first she felt anger, then guilt, and that in the end she understood that love needs no explanation. Maria didn't answer with words. She took her hand. Meanwhile, Thomas continued his routine disciplinedly at the transitional home. He participated in carpentry workshops, learned to read simple texts, and helped clean the common areas. He had gained some weight, and his expression was no longer that of an absent man. He remained reserved, but spoke more. In one of the group sessions, a young man asked what he missed most about his former life. Thomas thought for a few seconds and said, "My son's voice, saying my name, even if it's only once." The group fell silent. No one laughed, no one questioned. There was a new dignity in his words, as if his pain was no longer a wall, but a narrow but possible path. Maria, on her psychologist's recommendation, wrote a letter to herself. She was to do it as if a little girl was speaking to her future self. The exercise, seemingly simple, became a deep relief. She wrote, "Dear Maria, you didn't know what you were doing. You wanted love. You didn't want to be alone, and that led you to dark places. But now, Maria, you are different. You are a real mother. You are a woman who cares, who fights, who cries. Don't let the past steal what you have rebuilt." The letter was read in a closed session with other women. Some cried, others hugged her. For the first time, Maria felt that she could share her story without being stoned by glances. She allowed herself to cautiously tell part of what she had experienced. She did not name Thomas as her son, but she let the confusion, the error, the regret shine through. No one interrupted her. When she finished, one of those present said, "Your story is not an excuse, but it is an explanation." And that is already a step. Maria returned home that evening with swollen eyes, but with a lighter heart. Luis and Manuel began to attend a sensory stimulation program 3 times a week. The center had soft lights, varied textures, natural sounds, and therapists trained to work with children with severe disabilities. There, Luis discovered that he liked intense colors, especially red. Emmanuel preferred soft textures like velvet or cotton. The therapists created a special corner for them with adapted toys, large cushions, and instrumental music. At the end of each session, the two fell asleep side by side, holding hands. One day, when Luis showed interest in illustrated books, a volunteer brought a hardcover copy with large drawings and thick pages. Luis spent almost an hour looking at the pictures. When he saw one showing a bear hugging its cub, he pointed to the illustration and said, "Mama." Everyone held their breath. Maria, who was in the waiting room, was called. When she came in, Luis pointed at her again, with the book in his hand. He repeated the word like a mantra, "Mama, Mama." She knelt before him, hugged him gently, and said in his ear, "Yes, son, it's me. And I always will be." At the transitional home, Tomas asked to participate in a gardening workshop. He wanted to plant something. He said he had seen too many years of dry walls, dead earth, and needed to see something grow that wasn't himself. He was assigned a small plot in the center's courtyard. He planted sunflower seeds. He watered them every day with extreme care. Sometimes he spoke to them. He said things like, "No hurry, grow when you're ready," or "It's not your fault where you were sown." The therapists observed him without interfering. They knew that this was his way of healing. Months later, one of the children's therapists suggested organizing a short trip to the park. It would be the first time Luis and Manuel entered the outside world since they were rescued. The idea was carefully considered and finally approved. Everything was planned in detail: adapted transport, health assistance, emergency medical team, and an area in the park reserved exclusively for them. Maria was included in the outing. She arrived early, in simple but clean clothes, her hair tied up, and a cloth bag with rolls and fruit. When she saw her children get out of the vehicle, she felt her chest fill with air for the first time in years. Luis walked with help. Emmanuel was carried by a caregiver. Both looked at everything in wonder: the tall trees, the birds, the vast sky. They didn't know what a park was, but they discovered it together. For over an hour, the children played, laughed, got their hands dirty with earth, lay on a blanket, and listened to stories in the shade of a tree. Maria did not leave their side. She caressed them, gave them water, protected them from the sun. She was a mother like any other. A woman who, although she had made the worst mistake, had learned to love in the purest way, by caring. Before returning, Luis approached a sunflower growing by the roadside. He touched it with his fingertips. Emmanuel imitated him. The therapist took a photo. She did not upload it to social media. She did not share it. She printed it and gave it to Maria. She silently put it in her bag. This image has since become the silent symbol of all that had been and all that could still be. The sunflower photo hung on the wall of a humble office in the care home. It was not a trophy, not a postcard to show off. It was a reminder. Every time a new professional joined the team, someone would point to that picture and tell, in a few words, the story of the two children who had been born in the deepest darkness, but had turned their eyes towards the light. This photo did not show their scars, nor their pains, nor their diagnoses. It only captured a moment. Two small hands, touching a sunflower, with the curiosity of those who saw something for the first time. At that time, Luis was 7 years old, and Emmanuel was 4. Neither of them had been formally schooled, but they received daily stimulation. A special education teacher named Ernesto worked with them 3 times a week. Ernesto did not teach with books or grades. He taught with songs, objects, textures, and repetitions. He said that learning does not always go through the eyes, and that in cases like Luis and Manuel, it was necessary to appeal to the body, the rhythm, the heart. Patiently, he taught them to identify colors, sort shapes, understand when to say yes or no. Luis quickly learned to point to what he wanted. He began to develop a basic vocabulary mixed with gestures he invented himself. Emmanuel, on the other hand, was slower but more emotionally expressive. He laughed more easily. Sometimes he cried for no apparent reason, but he was also the first to respond with a smile when someone caressed him or sang him a familiar song. Both had become an essential part of the center. Their presence was not an exception. They were the soul of the corridors, those who reminded everyone why they did what they did. Maria, for her part, had made an unexpected leap. She began to coordinate a small group of mothers in precarious situations. She did not do it because she felt like a leader. She did it because someone asked her if she wanted to share her experiences. At first, she hesitated. But then she understood that telling what she had lived, without going into details that would hurt, but with honesty, could help other women not to repeat dangerous paths. In one of these sessions, she quietly said, "Shame blinded my eyes for years, but my children taught me to see again." This group became a space of trust. There were no judgments. There were hard stories, yes, but also laughter, shared recipes, prayers in a circle. Maria sometimes brought sweet bread she had learned to bake in her cooking class, offering it shyly. The others accepted it gratefully. She had achieved something unimaginable months before. She was no longer just the woman who had made a mistake, but became Maria, who listens, who helps, who stays. Tomás remained in the transitional home. He had bloomed silently, like those shrubs that bear no flowers in their first year, but suddenly, without warning, explode in color. In his sunflower patch, the plants were already over 1.5 meters tall. Every day he watered them, spoke to them, watched them grow with a mixture of wonder and tenderness. He said they were his children of the earth, who did not answer him but heard him anyway. Once, during a visit from his therapist, he was asked what he would do if he could see Luis and Emmanuel again. Tomás remained silent for a long time, then answered, "I wouldn't speak to them. I would just sit and look at them and tell them with my heart that I'm sorry." A psychologist on the team wrote a report suggesting a new meeting between Tomás and the children, this time outdoors, under supervision and without direct physical contact. The foundation reviewed the proposal cautiously. Not everyone agreed. Some believed it was better to maintain the definitive distance. Others argued that reconciliation, even if symbolic, was an essential part of healing. Maria was consulted. She listened carefully, and then, with a firm voice, said that she trusted her instinct, and that she was willing to allow it if her children were protected and did not suffer. The day of the meeting was carefully planned. A closed area in a community park was chosen, surrounded by trees and with an area for adapted games. Tomás arrived first, accompanied by 2 therapists. He wore a simple shirt and clean pants. He had a small notebook and a pencil with him. He sat on a bench in the shade and waited. Minutes later, Luis and Manuel arrived with their caregivers. They didn't know who they were going to see. They didn't fully understand the dimension of the moment. Luis walked slowly. Supported by an assistant, Emmanuel was in a wheelchair. When they were a few meters away, Tomás stood up. He didn't approach. He just looked at them. Luis, busy with a puzzle, didn't notice him. Emmanuel, however, turned his head and stared at him fixedly for several seconds. Then he turned back to his toy. Tomás cried silently. He didn't ask to come closer. He didn't raise his voice. He simply remained there, observing the children for whom he felt a love he never knew how to show. Then he opened his notebook and began to draw something. It was a sunflower. He drew it with clumsy but firm strokes. Then he tore it out and gave it to a caregiver. He asked her to give it to Luis, if possible. The caregiver carefully took it and placed it in the child's hands. Luis looked at the drawing and then at the man from a distance. He said nothing, but he held it all the way back. That afternoon, Maria received the drawing in the center's common room. She looked at it carefully. It was a sunflower, like the one her children had touched months before. She put it in her bag. She said nothing. She just took a deep breath and stroked Emmanuel's head while he slept. Days later, a strong storm hit the city. The community park was flooded. Several green areas were lost. Tomás's sunflower patch was devastated by wind and water. The next day he went to the site and found everything overthrown. He knelt before the muddy earth and did not say a single word. He stayed there for over an hour. Then he stood up and began to gather the roots that were still firm. He said he would plant again, that the flowers were not to blame for the storm, that, if they had once grown, they could grow again. In the foundation, a psychologist wrote in her monthly report, "The biggest mistakes are not always corrected. Sometimes they are simply integrated. Accepted, they transform into fertile ground so that something else can emerge from them." This idea resonated strongly with everyone. No one could change the origin of Luis and Emmanuel, but they could protect their present and prepare a future that would not repeat the shadows of the past. Luis celebrated his 8th birthday with a small party in the therapy room. There were no balloons or clowns. There was sweet bread, soft songs, and a burning candle on a muffin. Maria was present. Some children from the center also attended. Emmanuel laughed a lot that day. He clapped without rhythm, but with genuine joy. Luis remained serious, as if he didn't quite understand what it meant to have a birthday. But when they sang to him, he raised his head and clearly said, "Thank you." One word, just one, but for everyone present, it was enough. The sunflower drawing, now framed and discreetly hung on a wall of the center, became a silent symbol of what can be built on the rubble of pain. No one looked at it without remembering all it had cost to get there. It wasn't just a scribble. It was proof that even someone like Tomás, marked by error and ignorance, had been able to express something pure without words. Maria saw it every time she passed the occupational therapy room. Sometimes she stopped. She observed it for a long time. And then she continued, as if she needed to remind herself that she had chosen the path of rebuilding, not of forgetting. Luis made slow but steady progress. He no longer said just single words, but began to form short sentences. If something hurt him, he said it. If he was happy, he showed it with a wide smile and a soft applause. Emmanuel, for his part, continued to express himself more with gestures than with words, but his attention improved day by day. He looked into people's eyes more often, asked for help by raising his hand, and cried less. The therapists insisted that the emotional bond between the two brothers was one of the keys to their progress. They were connected in a way that went beyond language, as if they understood each other from a place where words are not enough. Maria no longer lived in the center. With the help of the foundation and a government program for women in precarious situations, she had obtained a small studio apartment in a modest but dignified building. There, with donated furniture and curtains she had sewn herself, she created a space she could call home for the first time in her life. It wasn't perfect, but it was her own. When the children spent weekends with her, they set up a makeshift bed on the floor, played with plastic cubes, and listened to children's songs on an old radio she had been given. A neighbor in the building, an elderly lady named Doña Eloisa, began to approach more frequently, at first out of curiosity. Then cautiously, she brought fruit, children's clothes, even freshly baked bread. Maria, initially distrustful, slowly opened up. One day, Doña Eloisa said to her, "Here, no one asks questions. If you take care of your loved ones, that's already more than many do." That was the first day Maria cried in front of someone outside the center. Not from sadness, but from relief. Tomás continued his life in the transitional home, but he was preparing to take another step. His therapist believed he was ready to live in a supervised residence with other adults who had gone through similar processes. The idea was not to release him into the world, but to allow him to develop autonomy with support. When he was told, Tomás accepted without enthusiasm or fear. He only said, "Whatever you decide is good." Yet that same night, he wrote a letter. He didn't say much, only 3 sentences. "Luis turned 8 years old. I want him to be well. If one day I can, I'll plant another sunflower for him." In the new residence, Tomás found room to breathe. He shared a room with a man his age, participated in gardening, cooking, and reading workshops, and continued to attend his life sessions. In one of them, he was asked to write about a word he considered important. He chose renunciation. He wrote that loving someone sometimes means moving away so that person can grow without shadows. His therapist congratulated him, not for the simple phrasing, but for what that realization implied. Tomás had finally understood that his role in his children's lives was not to appear, but to support from a distance what he had learned to accept. At the center, Luis began to attend a special needs school. The director of the institution, an empathetic and strict woman named Lorena, handled the case cautiously. She read all the reports, asked to speak with Maria and the child's therapists. When she met him, she greeted him with a smile and offered him a colorful drawing. Luis took it, looked at it, and said, "Beautiful." That was enough for Lorena to say yes. The first day of school was a mix of emotions. Maria led him by the hand to the entrance. Emmanuel remained at the center, as he was not yet able to attend an external institution. Luis, with his new backpack, looked around with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Maria bent down, hugged him, and whispered something in his ear. No one knew what it was, but when they separated, Luis walked without looking back. The following weeks were full of discoveries. Luis learned to write his name, count to 5, identify basic emotions in drawings. One afternoon at home, Maria saw him drawing. It was a stick figure with a sun above it and 2 hearts on the sides. When she asked him what it was, Luis said, "Me, Mama, and Emmanuel." Then he pointed to one of the hearts and said, "Papa far away." Maria remained motionless. She did not answer. She just hugged him tightly. During one of the monthly visits to the center, a therapist asked Emmanuel if he wanted to go to the park. He replied with a clear yes, the clearest he had spoken until then. The outing was planned with the usual care. Once in the park, Emmanuel was taken in his wheelchair to an area with adapted games. He touched the ropes, swung with help, and laughed so much that the other children joined in without questions. It was a moment of pure normality, without past or labels, just children playing outdoors. Doña Eloisa, Maria's neighbor, organized a small gathering to celebrate Luis starting school. She invited other neighbors, prepared hot chocolate and cookies. Luis sat on a plastic chair, receiving the applause with a shy smile. Emmanuel, on Maria's lap, also clapped, as if understanding that his brother was being celebrated. The women of the building began to see Maria with different eyes. She was no longer just the quiet neighbor. She was a mother who fought, who cooked, who cared. One afternoon, while sweeping the building's hallway, Maria received an envelope. It had no sender. Inside was a letter with uncertain handwriting and a drawing of a sunflower. It was from Tomás. He asked for nothing. He just said, "Thank you for allowing them to grow. I don't want to come back. I just want them to know that I am where I need to be. If you ever need earth to plant, I am here." Maria put the letter away without showing it to anyone. That night, while preparing dinner, Luis came with a drawing. It was another sunflower, this time larger, with roots and an open bloom. When Maria asked him why he had drawn it, Luis replied, "That's from Papa." It was the first time Maria heard her son say that word. She felt no anger. She felt something harder to explain, something that resembled forgiveness, but also hope. The story of Maria, Tomás, Luis, and Manuel was no longer a secret behind walls. Without becoming public, without headlines, without media judgments, it had begun to impact in small circles. Professionals, volunteers, neighbors, teachers, ordinary people who understood that the deepest darkness can sometimes make way for gentle but persistent lights. Luis continued to grow. Emmanuel, too. Maria, though tired, did not stop being grateful for every new day without pain, every new word, every gesture that had seemed impossible before. And Tomás continued to plant from a distance. This time, not sunflowers. Now he cultivated lavender. He said it was a plant that didn't need much to grow, just space, just time, like his children. In the year Luis turned 9 and Emmanuel 6, the story of their family was no longer told with the same tension as before. At the center, in school, among neighbors and health professionals, no one whispered about Maria's past, nor was her role as a mother questioned. No one forgot, but no one pointed fingers either. What once weighed as a shameful and monstrous secret was now understood as a human, painful story, full of mistakes, yes, but also full of new decisions. Maria had not been forgiven by decree, but she had earned the respect of those around her day by day, not because she was perfect, but because she had not fled. Luis could now write his full name. In class, The teachers celebrated every time he managed to read a word without help. It was difficult for him, but he didn't give up. He still used a walker, but his steps were surer. He no longer looked at the ground when he walked. He lifted his gaze, as if always looking for something, a familiar face, a sign, a small goal. Emmanuel continued his stimulation treatments. He had made great progress. Although he didn't articulate full sentences, he could express the essentials with a mix of sounds, gestures, and glances. His laughter was contagious, and when he was angry, he furrowed his brow so authentically that even the therapists laughed. One day, during an artistic activity, Luis was asked to draw his family. He made 3 figures. One was himself, another was Emmanuel, and the third was Maria. All were under a roof. Then, with a different color, he drew a tree to the right of the house. When asked what it represented, he said, "Papa is planted there." No one corrected his expression. On the contrary, the accompanying educator noted the sentence in her notebook, not as a curiosity, but as a symbolic truth that only a child can construct with such clarity. Maria continued to work at the community center, helping other women. Her story was only shared when necessary, never as an example of failure, but as proof of what life can do to someone who doesn't receive help in time. She insisted that she didn't speak to justify herself. She said her voice only served if it could prevent another young woman from repeating her path. In a meeting, a pregnant teenager asked her if she still felt guilty. Maria didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "Guilt never completely disappears, but now it lives in a corner, not at the center of my life." Tomas, for his part, remained in the supervised residential community. He had learned to bake bread. He participated in the communal kitchen and occasionally baked for the residents. Once a month, he sent a small package to the foundation, homemade bread, a short letter, and a drawing. Always the same: flowers, trees, sky, never people. Not out of forgetfulness, but out of respect. He knew he was not part of the core picture. And he had learned to accept it. In his letters, he wrote sentences like, "I am grateful that they are well," or "May silence keep them safe." He never asked for anything. He only thanked. Maria read these letters alone. She did not share them with the children, not out of revenge, but because she sensed that they didn't need to know more yet. They knew they had a father. They knew he wasn't there, and that was enough for them. Luis, however, began to ask questions. At 9 years old, his curiosity was sharper. One day, on their way home from school, he asked if his father was still alive. Maria said yes. Then he asked if she knew him. She nodded. Luis said nothing more. He walked home in silence. That night, he drew a tree with 2 broken branches and a flower in the middle. Maria understood the message. She did not correct him. She hugged him. Emmanuel also perceived the changes. Although he did not formulate questions, he became restless every time the papa tree was mentioned. Sometimes he went to the apartment balcony and looked at the sky. Maria said her children didn't need grand explanations, but constant presence. That gaps are not always filled with words, but with safe routines, with warm snacks, with the bedtime stories that were repeated every night. One afternoon, during a foundation team meeting, a psychologist raised the possibility of Tomas writing a letter to his children, not to explain what had happened, but to tell them who he was now. There was a debate. Some were against it. Others supported it. In the end, it was decided that Thomas could write the letter if he wished, but it would not be delivered immediately. Only when the children were old and mature enough to read it. Thomas wrote the letter in 2 days. It was short. He said, "Dear Luis and Emmanuel, I am not who I should have been. But you taught me something no one else could, that love is not enough when it hurts, and that silence can protect when words are not enough. I don't seek forgiveness, only that you live freely. If one day you want to know anything about me, I will be here like a tree that expects no shade, but still stands." The letter was kept in the Foundation's confidential archives. Maria was informed. She didn't want to read it. She only asked that, when the time came, a trusted person should deliver it. She didn't want to decide for her children, but also not to push them. She knew that time has its own language, and that forcing it only destroys what is still emerging. The following months were stable. Luis began to participate in adapted sports activities. He liked soccer, although he couldn't run like the other children. It was enough for him to kick the ball once and see someone receive it. That made him laugh. Emmanuel began to tolerate louder noises. He no longer covered his ears when the doorbell rang, nor did he cry at raised voices. A therapist said his emotional development was blooming faster than his linguistic development, that he understood much more than he could express. Maria hugged him every night, sang him self-invented songs, and told him close to his ear, "No matter how much you say, I still understand you." One weekend, during a park outing, Luis saw a sunflower plant near the path. He went to it, touched it. Then he looked at Maria and said, "That's from Papa." She didn't correct him. She said, "Yes, he planted it for you." Luis smiled, picked up a leaf from the ground, and put it in his pocket. This leaf remained under his pillow for weeks. That same week, Maria was invited to a conference on motherhood in precarious contexts. She hesitated to attend. It was difficult for her to speak publicly, but she attended. Before a hall of over 50 people, she told her story with respect, without presenting herself as a victim. She said, "The biggest mistake was not loving badly. It was not asking for help in time. It was believing that silence protected me. Today I understand that speaking, although it hurts, saves lives." At the end, there was applause. Not out of politeness, out of genuine respect. Tomas from the residence asked to plant new sunflowers in the backyard. He said this time it wasn't for him, but for all those who never knew how to ask for forgiveness. He cared for them with the same dedication as always. Every flower that bloomed was silently a word he could no longer say. Luis turned 10 in the spring. The celebration took place at the community center. There were paper balloons, a homemade cake, simple games. Emmanuel was by his side the whole time. Maria blew out the candles with them. When someone asked him what he wished for, Luis said, "May the light not go out." No one fully understood it, but everyone felt that this sentence came from a very deep source. That night when she arrived at the apartment, Maria found an envelope under the door. It had no sender. Inside was a dried sunflower leaf and a note. "Thank you for continuing to guard the light." There was no signature, but she knew who it was. She placed the leaf next to her son's and lit a small candle in the kitchen. She did not pray aloud. She just closed her eyes and thought of Tomas, of her children, of the past, of the pain. and also of that flame that against all odds was still burning. The story of Maria, Tomas, Luis, and Emmanuel no longer needed to be told in an exaggerated voice. Now it lived in every gaze, in every gesture, in every planted flower. A story that began with a mistake that cannot be erased, but was also written by hands that decided not to give up. The morning Emmanuel first spoke, his brother's name was one of those no one expected. It happened in the sensory room during a reading activity. Luis, as usual, sat in front of a picture book, pointing with his thin finger at each drawing and naming the animals one by one. When he reached the picture of a dog, he looked up and sought his brother's gaze. Emmanuel looked at him fixedly and, with obvious effort, mumbled something that at first no one understood. But when he repeated the word, everyone heard it. Luis. It wasn't clear, not loud, but it was his, a sound full of connection, memory, and love. The therapists held back from reacting excessively. They didn't want to scare him. Maria was called minutes later. When she arrived, Emmanuel didn't say the name again, but he looked at her with an expression that left no doubt. He was growing, understanding, blooming internally. Maria knelt down, caressed his face, and told him that he didn't need to say anything else, that she had already heard him. This small event invisibly ushered in a new cycle in this family's life. The pain was still there, yes. The mistake, too. But it was no longer the main shadow. It had shifted, making way for the achievements, the daily life, the tenderness that the years, the constancy, and the care had sown on inhospitable ground. Luis and Emmanuel were not simply survivors. They were children who, each at their own pace, learned to navigate the world in their unique way. Luis began to write small sentences in a blue notebook his teacher had given him. They were not diaries or narratives. They were loose thoughts, images, simple expressions. Today, Emmanuel laughed. Mama hugged me. The bread was warm. On one of the last pages, he wrote, "I came from the darkness, but now I can see." This sentence reached the hands of the therapists, his teacher, and finally Maria. When she read it, she cried silently. Not from sadness, but from something deeper, from redemption. There was no possible forgiveness for certain mistakes, but there was the possibility of reparation, of walking a different path, of not letting the past stain everything. Tomas, from his residence, no longer sent letters. Not because he had distanced himself, but because he understood that he no longer needed to leave traces. In his corner of the earth, he now cultivated marigolds, a flower believed to heal wounds. One afternoon, sitting on the garden bench, he watched the sunset and told the caregiver next to him. Sometimes silence also speaks. One just has to learn to listen to it. At school, Luis was chosen to represent his class in a small, adapted play. He played a tree. He stood the whole time with a sign that read, "Strong Roots." Emmanuel watched him from the front row, sitting on Maria's lap. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but every time he looked at him, he smiled. Maria did not leave his side for a single moment. At the end of the performance, the applause was neither loud nor euphoric. It was gentle, respectful, full of meaning. That night, Maria lit a candle at the window of her apartment. Not out of tradition, nor religion, just because she had to. Luis came closer and asked her if it was because of the tree. She nodded. Emmanuel snuggled up to her. All three remained like that, silent, watching the flickering flame. As if all that had been experienced, the pain, the guilt, the resistance, the love, could be contained in that silent moment. The story of Maria, Tomas, Luis, and Emmanuel never reached the media. It was never told on television or published on social media. It wasn't necessary. It became an intimate legend among social workers, nurses, teachers, and mothers who once felt alone. A story that reminded us that the most serious mistakes do not arise from hatred, but often from desperation, from abandonment, from not knowing. But it also taught that there is no darkness so deep that it cannot be penetrated by a spark of light. That every child, however limited, has a right to a dignified life. And that every mother, even one who has made mistakes, can learn to nurture, to hold, to heal. Today, Luis continues to go to school. He likes to write, to draw, to look out the window. Emmanuel is still in treatment, but he speaks new words every month. Maria cooks, works, listens. She lives without hiding. She expects no recognition. She just wants her children to grow up free from the burden that once marked her. Tomas continues to plant. He does not expect to be remembered. He just wishes the cycle not to repeat itself. And you, who have heard this story to the end, if you have ever doubted the power of accompaniment, of listening, of firm and unconditional love, remember Luis touching the sunflower, Emmanuel saying his name, Maria before the fire, Tomas learning to be silent so that others can grow. Because it is not about justifying mistakes, but about not abandoning them to silence. And if this story has touched you in any way, I invite you to leave your comment, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. Here, in Mexico Prohibido, we continue to tell the stories that many prefer to keep silent, not to scandalize, but to understand. Because sometimes, only by understanding can we prevent it from happening again.